Arben, Leka, and Dritan were just three young men from a forgotten Albanian neighborhood, but their ambition would ignite a storm that spread across Europe. From empty streets to secret smuggling routes, they built the Red Circle, a ruthless cartel feared in every city it touched. This is the story of loyalty, betrayal, and the blood ties that created one of the most dangerous criminal empires the continent has ever seen. In the early 2000s, in a forgotten neighborhood of Albania, life was harsh and opportunities were scarce. The streets were lined with abandoned factories, crumbling apartment buildings, and graffiti that marked old territorial fights. Young men, with little to lose, spent their days wandering between empty streets and broken alleys. Among them, a small group of friends shared more than just survival. They shared a bond built on loyalty, secrecy, and a quiet desire to escape their bleak reality. They called themselves the Red Circle. At first, the Red Circle was nothing more than a brotherhood. They protected one another, fought off bullies, and occasionally stole food or small items to survive. Their neighborhood was dangerous, and anyone who showed weakness was quickly pushed aside. But the members of the Red Circle were smart, observant, and patient. They understood the power of fear and how it could be used to their advantage. Slowly, their petty crimes became more organized. They learned who to watch, who to avoid, and which paths were safest for escape. As months passed, the group began to realize that survival alone would never be enough. The streets offered little money, and they wanted more than mere existence. With their small but growing reputation for toughness, they started targeting rival gangs and isolated individuals. They stole small amounts of cash, cars, and valuable items, always careful not to attract too much attention. But every theft, every skirmish, increased their confidence. The Red Circle began to see themselves not just as survivors, but as potential rulers of their environment. Their unity became their strength. Each member had a specific role. One watched the streets, another planned the thefts, while the others acted as enforcers. They developed a code: loyalty above all, silence above everything. If one member betrayed the group, consequences would be swift and severe. Fear and respect grew together, shaping the Red Circle into more than just a street gang. They were a shadow network, invisible yet formidable. The turning point came when they successfully took control of a small but strategic corner of their neighborhood. They marked it with subtle signs that warned outsiders. No one entered without permission, and anyone who challenged them vanished from sight for days. The community began to whisper about the Red Circle. Stories of their courage, ruthlessness, and cunning spread like wildfire, attracting attention from both allies and enemies. Their name became known, not just as a group of young men trying to survive, but as a force capable of controlling their corner of the city. By the end of their first year, the Red Circle had transformed. What started as a brotherhood of friends struggling to survive had evolved into a small, disciplined, and ambitious organization. They had tasted the power that came with fear, respect, and control, and it left them hungry for more. The streets that had once threatened to swallow them now belonged to them, and the seed of ambition was planted. This small group from a forgotten neighborhood was about to take the first steps towards something far larger and far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. The Red Circle's rise was not without consequence. In the second year of their existence, the group faced its first real test of confrontation with a rival street crew from a neighboring district. This crew, larger and older, had controlled the local streets for years, and the Red Circle's growing influence was seen as a direct threat. What started as a minor argument over territory quickly escalated into violence. Knives flashed in dark alleys, and the sound of fists hitting flesh echoed through abandoned buildings. One member of the Red Circle fell that night, leaving a scar not just on the body, but on the minds of everyone involved. The loss created a blood debt, a dangerous promise that vengeance would be sought no matter the cost. The incident forced the Red Circle into hiding. For days, The streets felt empty and hostile. Their allies were nervous, and every shadow seemed to hold an enemy. Yet this time of fear and tension became a crucial lesson. The members learned the importance of strategy over brute force, of patience over impulsive action. They studied their rivals, mapped out escape routes, and watched for weaknesses in the enemy's operations. What could have destroyed them instead became a moment of transformation. The blood debt marked their evolution from a street gang into something more calculated, more dangerous. News of the clash spread quickly. Rumors exaggerated the Red Circle's actions, describing them as almost supernatural in their ruthlessness. The community, which once ignored the small group, began to notice them. Fear and respect intertwined, creating an aura that surrounded their name. People started avoiding certain streets after dark, whispering about what the Red Circle might do if crossed. Even the rival crew became cautious, unsure of the limits of the young group's ambition. This newfound reputation became their most powerful weapon. The Red Circle realized that fear could be more effective than direct confrontation. They no longer needed to fight every battle. A well-placed threat, a calculated act of violence, or even the suggestion of power could secure control. Their approach shifted from reacting to circumstances to shaping them. Each member took on new responsibilities. Some handled intelligence, tracking movements of rivals. Others focused on securing resources and hiding assets. A few ensured loyalty within the group by enforcing strict rules. The organization became a precise machine, each part working in sync and all bound by the unspoken agreement that betrayal would not be tolerated. By the end of the year, the first blood debt had not only been avenged, but had reshaped the identity of the Red Circle. They were no longer simply survivors. They were predators in their own right. Every step they took, every territory they claimed, was part of a calculated plan to expand influence. The streets that had once been unpredictable and dangerous now seemed like a chessboard, and the Red Circle was learning to play with deadly precision. The first blood debt had proven that violence, when controlled and strategic, was a tool for power. It was the spark that ignited a hunger for domination, setting the stage for their next moves and the long, ruthless path that would eventually carry them far beyond their neighborhood. After solidifying their control over their home streets, the Red Circle realized that local dominance could only take them so far. Money was the key to power, and the streets of Albania offered limited opportunity. The turning point came when they discovered the hidden world of smugglers who moved goods through secret mountain routes connecting Albania to neighboring countries. These paths, carved through rugged terrain and thick forests, had long been used to transport contraband, anything from stolen vehicles to illegal goods. The Red Circle saw potential in these shadowy channels. What had once been a small gang now had the chance to become a network with international reach. At first, they began cautiously. Trusted members acted as couriers, moving small packages through the hills under the cover of night. The work was dangerous. Border patrols and rival groups threatened every step. Yet the thrill and the profit created a new obsession. Each successful delivery increased their confidence and their reputation. The gang started to gather resources. Old vehicles were modified for speed and concealment. Hidden compartments were installed, and safe houses were prepared along the routes. Their operations became meticulous, almost mechanical. Every movement was calculated, every risk assessed. The Red Circle was no longer a simple street gang. They were becoming a cartel in miniature, operating in shadows with precision. The money flowing in changed everything. With new funds, they expanded their reach, buying influence and forming quiet alliances with small local criminals who could provide information or protection. They began hiring individuals for specialized tasks, drivers, lookouts, and even people to manage logistics. The gang that once survived on petty theft now commanded resources that rivaled small businesses. Power was no longer about intimidation alone. It was about control, strategy, and infrastructure. The streets of their city remained theirs, but now their eyes were on a much larger map, one that stretched beyond national borders. As the Red Circle expanded into smuggling, they encountered challenges that tested their discipline and unity. Rivals attempted ambushes on mountain paths. Law enforcement occasionally discovered hidden shipments, and internal arguments arose over profits. But each obstacle made them smarter. They learned to anticipate dangers, set traps for enemies, and plan routes that were almost impossible to intercept. The members who excelled in these operations were rewarded with respect and higher stakes, while those who faltered were quietly removed or reassigned. Efficiency became their mantra, secrecy their shield. By the end of this phase, the Red Circle had transformed completely. They had moved from surviving in forgotten alleys to controlling an invisible network that connected Albania to European markets. Their influence reached far beyond their neighborhood, creating a silent empire built on risk, trust, and fear. The mountain routes were no longer just paths. They were lifelines to power, profit, and dominance. The gang that had once been a small group of friends was now a growing force in the criminal underworld, with ambitions that could no longer be contained. Their eyes were fixed on Europe, and nothing would stand in their way. Once the Red Circle had mastered the smuggling routes through Albania, their ambitions extended beyond national borders. Europe became their next target. The gang knew that moving goods into foreign cities was far more complicated than operating at home. Law enforcement was stricter, rival groups were more organized, and the consequences of being caught were severe. But the Red Circle had learned patience and secrecy. They sent their most trusted members abroad to scout potential cities, blend into local communities, and establish safe zones. The operation had to be invisible. Any mistake could destroy years of careful planning. Italy was their first major foothold. A few members settled quietly in small towns where Albanian migrant communities lived. They opened businesses as fronts delivery services, small warehouses, and cafes, which allowed them to store goods and meet contacts without drawing attention. While the locals saw nothing unusual, the Red Circle quietly mapped the streets, monitored rival gangs, and learned the patterns of police patrols. They discovered that fear and discretion were more effective than force. By staying unseen, they could control entire neighborhoods without firing a single shot. Next, Belgium became another hub. The country's ports offered an ideal entry point for shipments, and its multicultural neighborhoods allowed outsiders to move unnoticed. The Red Circle adapted their strategies to fit the local environment. They built alliances with minor gangs, sharing profits in exchange for loyalty and information. These alliances were never permanent. The Red Circle remained unpredictable, ensuring that no one could truly trust them. Their reputation for cold calculation and ruthlessness spread quietly. By the time law enforcement noticed anomalies, the Red Circle had already established a strong, invisible presence. In the United Kingdom, they faced the most challenges. Cities were larger, neighborhoods more tightly controlled, and criminal networks more entrenched. The Red Circle could not rely on fear alone. They had to master subtle influence, bribery, and careful manipulation. They found individuals willing to work as intermediaries, people who could move goods, provide shelter, or send messages without being traced. Even within migrant communities, the gang's control was hidden. No one outside the group understood the extent of their operations. The Red Circle was learning to operate like a shadow within a shadow, almost untouchable because they never showed their true power openly. The silent invasion reshaped the identity of the Red Circle. They were no longer simply a gang or even a cartel. They were an invisible network stretching across Europe, connecting mountains, ports, and city streets. They did not need to provoke battles to expand. They thrived on manipulation, intelligence, and patience. Rival gangs often underestimated them, believing the Red Circle to be small and insignificant. But by the time anyone realized the truth, The group had already woven itself into the criminal fabric of the cities they entered. Fear, secrecy, and strategy had become their most potent weapons. By the end of this phase, the Red Circle had transformed into a force that could operate internationally without leaving a trace. They were ghost-like, powerful, and disciplined. The streets they had once ruled in Albania now felt like a starting point, a training ground for a far more ambitious empire. Their eyes were fixed on expansion, and their methods had evolved into something far more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Europe was theirs to influence, and the Red Circle had only begun to show its true power. Even the most disciplined organizations are vulnerable from within, and for the Red Circle, that vulnerability came in the form of ambition and jealousy. As their power grew across Europe, tensions among the members began to rise. Some felt they were carrying the heaviest burdens, risking the most, while others reaped larger rewards. Arguments over shipments, territories, and profits that had been handled quietly in the past now festered into deep resentment. The sense of loyalty that had once bound the group together began to erode, replaced by suspicion and silent rivalry. The breaking point came when a single member, ambitious and reckless, secretly made a deal with a foreign criminal network. The deal promised massive profit, far beyond what the Red Circle had ever earned before, but it carried enormous risk. When the shipment arrived at its destination, it was intercepted, and a fortune worth millions vanished overnight. The loss was devastating. The members of the Red Circle were forced into immediate crisis mode, scrambling to understand who had betrayed them and how to recover the missing goods. The incident shook the foundation of trust, leaving everyone questioning their closest allies. Panic and paranoia spread like wildfire. Meetings were held in hidden safe houses, with members constantly watching one another. The betrayal revealed weaknesses that no rival attack could have exposed. The once unified group, which had conquered streets and crossed borders with precision, now faced its most dangerous opponent: internal conflict. Every decision became fraught with doubt, every glance suspicious. Even long-standing members, who had proven themselves through years of loyalty, were scrutinized. The atmosphere, once disciplined and confident, became tense and unpredictable. The fallout from the betrayal was not limited to internal strife. Rival gangs and law enforcement noticed cracks in the Red Circle's operations. Some shipments were delayed or lost, messages went unanswered, and alliances outside Albania began to falter. The cartel, which had operated like a well-oiled machine, now stumbled through operations, vulnerable to attacks that had previously been unimaginable. What had begun as a small act of greed risked dismantling the empire they had worked so hard to build. Yet, amidst the chaos, the Red Circle's resilience emerged. Leaders enforced strict measures to regain control, identifying loyal members and reassigning critical tasks. They developed contingency plans for future operations, ensuring that no single betrayal could jeopardize the entire network again. The organization, scarred but not destroyed, became even more disciplined, recognizing that survival depended on trust, vigilance, and the elimination of complacency. The betrayal, though painful, forced the Red Circle to evolve, sharpening their instincts and redefining the boundaries of loyalty. By the end of this period, the cartel had weathered a storm that could have destroyed them. The first internal fracture had occurred, leaving a lasting mark on their collective psyche. Members had learned that power came not only from fear and strategy, but from unity, and that internal weakness could be more lethal than any external threat. The Red Circle emerged from this trial more cautious, more calculated, and more dangerous. The shadow they cast across Europe had grown darker, and while betrayal had shaken them, it also prepared them for the violent and unpredictable future that awaited. The Red Circle had grown in power and reach, but no empire remains hidden forever. Across Europe, law enforcement began noticing strange pattern shipments disappearing, small gangs acting with unusual coordination, and criminal activity that stretched across borders yet seemed impossibly connected. Analysts and investigators started piecing together fragments of a puzzle that led to Albania. Intelligence agencies shared information, and soon a special task force was formed to track the Red Circle. For the first time, the gang that had always operated in the shadows felt the weight of a coordinated response closing in around them. At first, the Red Circle underestimated the threat. They believed their secrecy, careful planning, and small numbers would protect them. They had faced rivals, betrayals, and dangerous smugglers, and survived each test. But law enforcement was different. Unlike their human adversaries, the authorities had access to surveillance, technology, and legal power. They could trace financial transactions, monitor communications, and track the movement of people and goods across multiple countries. The Red Circle realized that their mistakes, previously minor, could now have catastrophic consequences. Safe houses that had once felt impenetrable were suddenly at risk. Agents watched the streets, noted patterns, and mapped routes. Vehicles were tracked, phone lines tapped, and undercover operatives infiltrated communities. The Red Circle, accustomed to operating in shadows, now faced an invisible enemy whose reach was vast and unrelenting. Members began disappearing, not because of rivals, but because the authorities were quietly dismantling their operations piece by piece. Every shipment became a potential trap, every meeting a calculated risk. The task force's presence introduced fear and tension into the gang that had thrived on confidence and control. Previously, loyal members began questioning the leadership, wondering if their strategies were still sufficient. The Red Circle had survived blood debts, betrayals, and rival attacks. But the pressure from law enforcement was different. It was slow, calculated, and nearly invisible. The gang found itself constantly adapting, developing new routes, disguises, and contingency plans. Each step forward required more caution, more intelligence, and greater coordination than ever before. Despite the pressure, the Red Circle refused to surrender. They learned to balance aggression with caution, maintaining operations in some cities while abandoning others temporarily. All eyes were relied upon more than ever, and the group became disciplined in a way it had never been. Even as their empire faced unprecedented scrutiny, their reputation for ruthlessness and cleverness continued to spread. Rivals and communities alike could sense that the gang was under siege, yet still capable of retaliation if provoked. By the end of this period, the Red Circle had survived the initial assault of the task force, but not without cost. Safe houses were compromised, shipments were seized, and a few low-level members were arrested. The gang realized that Europe was no longer a playground. They were trapped in a game where mistakes could mean prison or death. The shadow empire that had moved quietly across countries now faced the harsh reality of law enforcement scrutiny. Their power remained, but it was more fragile than ever, and every decision carried the weight of potential collapse. The Red Circle had entered a new phase one, where survival would depend on intelligence, caution, and the ability to outthink an invisible, relentless enemy. The pressure from law enforcement had already shaken the Red Circle, but the greatest threat came not from the outside, but from within. As arrests increased and shipments were intercepted, the once united cartel began to fracture. Tension spread among members, who disagreed on how to respond to the growing danger. Some argued that they should leave Europe entirely, retreating to safer countries to regroup and rebuild. Others insisted on staying, believing that abandoning their empire would be a sign of weakness, and that control could still be maintained through strategy and fear. This disagreement created factions, and the bonds of loyalty that had held the group together for years began to unravel. The internal war was quiet at first, marked by suspicion, distrust, and subtle sabotage. Members began withholding information, misdirecting shipments, and secretly negotiating with outside contacts for personal gain. The careful structure that had made the Red Circle so effective now became a source of vulnerability. Operations faltered, shipments were delayed, and alliances that had been carefully cultivated across Europe started to crumble. The cartel's enemies sensed the division and began testing boundaries, hoping to exploit the internal chaos. Even within families and neighborhoods, loyalties were questioned, and old friends became potential threats. As the factions grew bolder, the conflict escalated into violence. Members who were suspected of disloyalty were quietly eliminated or punished to send warnings. Safe houses that had once been secure were now the sites of confrontations, with trust eroding further. The very streets and cities that the Red Circle had dominated began to feel unstable. Rivals, sensing weakness, moved to claim territory, while law enforcement observed the disintegration, waiting for the right moment to strike decisively. The cartel that had once seemed untouchable was now crumbling from within, each action of vengeance and paranoia accelerating its collapse. The leaders struggled to maintain control, but the fractures were too deep. Factions operated independently, pursuing their own agendas and ignoring the coordinated strategies that had made the cartel powerful. Communication broke down, and members who had once followed orders without question began to act on impulse. The Red Circle's ability to adapt, which had once been their greatest strength, now became inconsistent and unreliable. The empire that had spanned mountains, ports, and European cities was now vulnerable, and each misstep threatened to unravel everything they had built. By the end of this period, the internal war had left the Red Circle fractured and exhausted. The unity that had allowed them to rise from a small street gang in Albania to a shadow empire across Europe no longer existed. Fear and distrust had replaced loyalty, and ambition had become more dangerous than any external threat. While the cartel still retained some power and influence, it was a shell of its former self, teetering on the edge of collapse. The internal war had revealed the true cost of greed and ambition, showing that sometimes the most dangerous enemies are not rivals or law enforcement, but the very people bound to you by blood and loyalty. The collapse of the Red Circle was both inevitable and spectacular. The internal war had left them fractured, and law enforcement had been closing in for months, quietly monitoring movements, tracking shipments, and intercepting communications. By the time the final coordinated operation was launched, the cartel was already weakened. Safe houses were abandoned, key members had fled, and the once tightly controlled network had splintered into disconnected fragments. What had once been an invisible empire stretching across Europe was now a ghost of its former self, vulnerable, disorganized, and exposed. The task force struck in multiple countries simultaneously, targeting known hubs and suspected members. In Italy, warehouses were raided, revealing hidden caches of goods and weapons. In Belgium, financial accounts were frozen, cutting off critical funding streams. In the UK, undercover agents arrested low-level operatives who had once moved goods and messages for the cartel. Despite the precision of the operation, it became clear that the Red Circle had already begun to self-destruct. Leaders were missing, members had vanished to distant cities, and the organization had no central command to resist or regroup. The empire had crumbled under its own weight, long before the authorities delivered the final blow. As investigators pieced together the remains of the network, they uncovered evidence of betrayals, internal executions, and abandoned shipments worth millions. It became evident that the group's greatest threat had not been law enforcement, but the divisions and rivalries that had festered within. Factions that once cooperated seamlessly were now at odds, and trust had been entirely replaced by suspicion. The Red Circle, which had survived rival gangs, smugglers, and countless risks, had finally fallen victim to its own ambition and greed. The aftermath left a trail of unanswered questions and fragmented power. Some members disappeared entirely, rumored to have fled to South America, Eastern Europe, or even deeper into Albania. Others were captured and faced long prison sentences, becoming symbols of the empire's downfall. The streets that had once trembled under the influence of the Red Circle slowly returned to normal, but the legend of the cartel lingered. Communities whispered of the ghostly empire that had moved in silence across countries. controlling neighborhoods without detection and disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. Despite their collapse, the Red Circle's story became a cautionary tale. It showed how a small group from a forgotten neighborhood could rise to dominate streets and cities across Europe, using fear, strategy, and meticulous planning. It demonstrated the power of loyalty and the dangers of betrayal, illustrating that ambition, when unchecked, can destroy even the most disciplined organizations. The cartel's empire, though broken, left a lasting mark on the criminal underworld, shaping the methods of other groups who studied their tactics, alliances, and the mistakes that led to their fall. In the end, the Red Circle became more than a criminal organization. It became a dark legend. Their rise and fall were a reminder of how quickly power can grow and disappear, and how the very bonds that create strength can also create destruction. The streets, once dominated by their presence, returned to life, but the shadow of the Red Circle lingered, a silent warning of ambition, betrayal, and the fragility of power. Their story closed not with a victory, but with the quiet devastation of an empire that had reached too far, too fast, and was ultimately undone by its own blood ties.